Have you ever seen a ghost with 4 legs, scorched fur, and eyes that forgot how to trust? This isn't just a story, it's a resurrection. A burned-out dog, a broken man, and a girl haunted by fire, until they found each other. What happened next stunned an entire town. So stay. Watch closely. And if this hits you where it hurts, like it did us, tap like, subscribe, and follow the journey. Because some scars don't end a life, they begin one. The summer heat in northern Oregon was unusual that year, thick, dry, and unrelenting. The sky above the town of Caldera Ridge had turned a shade of amber gray, where sunlight fought through a curtain of smoke that drifted in from the mountains to the east. On the outskirts of the town, where the pine forest once stood lush and humming with life, a hellish blaze had swallowed nearly 12,000 acres in just 3 days. The air smelled of scorched earth and pine resin, the wind carried ash like snow, settling over rooftops, sidewalks, even children's bicycles left abandoned in backyards. The Caldera Ridge Fire Department had called in mutual aid from nearby counties. Among the responding teams was a mobile unit from the state's Wildfire Canine Search and Rescue Corps. The fire had been too intense, too fast, and too hungry. Entire groves vanished in hours, wildlife disappeared without a sound, and charred skeletons of trees stood like mourners over the ashes of the forest floor. It wasn't until the 5th day that containment lines started to hold. In the blackened remnants of a forest access road, just beyond the collapsed shell of a ranger's outpost, one of the search teams stumbled upon something unexpected. Beneath the twisted, smoldering frame of a utility truck, something moved. A faint, almost imperceptible rustle. It was Cody Myers, a rookie firefighter with a lanky frame, soot-stained cheeks, and eyes that still hadn't grown numb to horror, who saw it first. He knelt and peered under the debris, heart pounding. "Over here," he shouted, waving frantically. The rest of the team rushed over as Cody pulled out a battered flashlight. Illuminated in the beam was a German shepherd, huddled low against the ground, barely breathing. Its coat was once a proud sable, now matted with ash and singed fur. The left hind leg was scorched to raw flesh, the pads of its paws blackened, its ribs visible beneath its trembling frame. But its eyes were open. Wide, glassy, and hollow, as though it had already begun retreating deep into its own mind. Captain Luis Ortega, a seasoned search and rescue lead with 30 years under his belt and a fatherly air about him, crouched beside Cody. Ortega was broad-shouldered, slow to speak, but decisive when it mattered. He had seen animals like this before, trained, loyal, and broken by something even bravery couldn't overcome. No tags. No harness. No chip, Ortega murmured after a quick scan. But he's no stray. He's a working dog. You can see it in the way he holds himself, even in pain, still alert. The team gently coaxed the dog from under the wreckage using a blanket and quiet tones. When lifted, the dog didn't growl, didn't resist, only let out a low, hoarse whimper. A name tag melted into the wreckage was found nearby, too damaged to be legible. The only identifier the team could agree on was the shadow-like way he moved, almost invisible among the smoke. They called him Shadow. Shadow was estimated to be around 3 years old. A strong build, albeit now gaunt, with intelligent, almond-shaped eyes that had seen far more than most creatures his age. His ears remained pricked in that classic shepherd posture, though they now flicked nervously at every sudden sound. His tail, once likely a proud banner, now hung limply, dusted with soot. There was no sign of a handler, and no one came forward in the following days to claim him. Shadow was transported to the Clear Creek Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, a facility nestled on the outskirts of Caldera Ridge. The center, usually meant for injured owls, foxes, and raccoons, found itself overwhelmed with displaced animals from the fire. Yet, when the call came about a burned search dog with no handler, Dr. Samantha Rowe, the head vet at Clear Creek, insisted they make room. Dr. Rowe was in her late 40s, compact and quick-moving, with a tightly coiled bun of graying red hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She had a reputation for being no-nonsense with staff but gentle with animals. Years ago, she had worked with K-9 units before shifting to wildlife medicine. The news of Shadow hit her with a quiet kind of grief. They set him up in a shaded enclosure away from the public, close to the main clinic. Treatment began immediately, for fluids, topical burns care, antibiotics, and a quiet environment. Physically, his chances were decent. Mentally, however, he was locked somewhere unreachable. He ate only if no one was watching, responded to no voice, and flinched at the faintest mechanical sound, likely reminders of fire trucks, sirens, or the crackle of the blaze. Meanwhile, in a small cottage not far from the center lived Evelyn Harper, a 10-year-old girl with deep hazel eyes and a cascade of curly light brown hair she never let anyone brush. Her world had turned upside down 2 weeks ago when her family's cabin caught fire at the edge of town. She and her grandmother escaped with nothing but their lives. Her parents had been out of town. Evelyn hadn't spoken much since the incident. Evelyn was quiet, almost ghost-like in her movements, trailing behind her grandmother to the market, to the library, and sometimes to the fence outside Clear Creek, where she'd lean and listen to the wind. Her grandmother, May Harper, was a resilient woman in her 70s, with strong arms, a worn denim apron, and the kind of sharp wisdom only old age and hard years could provide. She was the one who suggested Evelyn start sketching again. Evelyn refused. Her drawings had burned with the house. One afternoon, as Evelyn waited for her grandmother to finish errands near the center, she wandered close to the outer fence. From a distance, through the slats, she saw a dark figure curled up in the shade of an enclosure. A dog, but not like the farm dogs she'd known. This one had the look of a soldier. Even in stillness, he looked like a guardian wrapped in grief. Evelyn stared. Shadow didn't move, but something in her chest stirred. A quiet sense of recognition. Two souls scorched by the same kind of flame. She returned the next day. And the day after that. She never spoke to the staff, never entered the center, only sat quietly on a nearby rock, sometimes humming to herself. Occasionally, when the wind was just right, the edge of her song drifted into Shadow's enclosure. And once, just once, Shadow lifted his head. He looked, not directly at her, but toward the song. And Evelyn smiled. That evening, as her grandmother brushed ash off their porch chairs, Evelyn said something for the first time in days. "I want to go back tomorrow." To most, it was a simple request. To May Harper, it was everything. By the time the week ended, the staff at Clear Creek had begun to notice that Shadow's breathing was slower in the afternoons. Less tense. Less watchful. No one had connected it yet to the silent girl on the rock. But healing often begins in unseen ways, like roots stirring beneath burnt soil. And so it was that under the smoke-filled sky of Oregon, two beings, one K-9, one child, both marked by fire, began an invisible bond neither could name. They did not need to speak. Their silence was the beginning of something neither knew they needed. But it would change everything. The days after the fire settled into a rhythm of hushed footsteps and whispered hopes at the Clear Creek Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The skies over Caldera Ridge had cleared, but the scent of scorched wood still lingered in the air like a bitter memory. The burned trees, stripped bare and blackened, lined the horizon in grim procession. And within the center's back enclosure, behind a curtain of plastic meant to keep out the wind and strangers, Shadow lay curled in the farthest corner of his kennel, unmoving. Though his wounds had begun to heal under the diligent care of the veterinary team, Shadow refused to engage with the world around him. Every time someone approached, whether it was Dr. Rowe with a bowl of fresh food or the young assistant cleaning his space, Shadow shrank further into himself. He flinched at shifting shadows, ducked away from outstretched hands, and ignored every sound except for the rustle of leaves or the distant calls of other animals. His eyes, those deep, ember-dark pools, seemed to see something far beyond the present moment. Something burning. Something lost. The staff began to refer to him as, Ghost Dog. Not cruelly, but with a kind of reverence, like they were in the presence of a spirit only partially tethered to the living world. He walked without sound, watched without blinking, and despite the best efforts of those around him, he showed no interest in food unless left entirely alone. His only comforts were silence and shadow. Among those who noticed this pattern was Grace Patel, a new volunteer barely a month into her service. Grace was in her early 20s, short and round-faced, with a gentle demeanor and a passion for animal rehabilitation. She wore oversized cardigans and always had a pencil tucked behind one ear, scribbling observations in her notepad. Though inexperienced, she had an intuitive calmness that animals often responded to. But not Shadow. Not even Grace's softest voice or slowest movements could coax him from his corner. "It's like his soul's been packed away," she murmured one morning to Dr. Rowe. "Tied up and hidden somewhere we can't reach." "He's lost something," Rowe replied quietly, and whatever it was, it kept him anchored. She sighed, rubbing at her temple. "Without it, he's just floating." Meanwhile, Evelyn Harper had begun to stretch the boundaries of her daily routine. After school, while her grandmother thought she was at the library, Evelyn made her way to Clear Creek. She discovered a hole in the wire fence behind the native plant nursery, a gap just wide enough for a small girl with scraped knees and a quick heart. From there, she could slip along the back path and reach the far enclosures without being noticed. Each afternoon, Evelyn sat in the same spot, a concrete step near the back of Shadow's kennel. She brought a small cloth blanket, salvaged from what was once her bedroom, and sat cross-legged with her hands in her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't move. Sometimes she drew circles in the dust with her finger. Other times, she simply listened to the breeze in the trees or the quiet shuffle of animals around her. The silence was never empty when she was near Shadow. At first, he didn't react to her. He didn't even lift his head. But Evelyn was patient. She had seen what fire could take, and she knew that what was broken didn't always want to be seen. One Wednesday afternoon, she brought a small object with her, a plastic figurine of a German shepherd she had once gotten at a county fair. Its paint was chipped, and its tail was missing, but it had somehow survived the fire in her backpack. She placed it gently outside the kennel gate and whispered, "This is yours if you want it." Shadow didn't move. But when Evelyn returned the next day, the figurine was gone. Nestled instead in the far corner of the kennel, just beneath Shadow's chin. That same evening, Brenda, the center's head caretaker, a tall, broad-shouldered woman in her mid-50s with weathered hands and a sharp voice softened by decades of kindness, noticed the toy while checking on Shadow. "Anyone give him this?" she asked. "No," Grace replied, confused. "Not that I saw." "Odd. It wasn't here yesterday." Brenda narrowed her eyes at the security camera feed, which covered most of the facility but not the back enclosures. "Strange things happen after fires," she muttered, mostly to herself. Evelyn continued her visits. Each day, she brought something small, an acorn, a feather, a crumpled poem she had once written and memorized. She never stayed long, just enough to leave her offering and sit in silence. Shadow began to notice her more. His ears would tilt when she arrived. His breathing slowed. He didn't retreat when she approached. Though his eyes remained clouded with caution, they were no longer vacant. Then, one afternoon, a storm rolled in from the coast. Thick, rolling clouds brought sudden wind and a cold, biting rain. The center staff scrambled to cover kennels and secure enclosures. Evelyn, who had been sitting near Shadow's kennel, was caught in the downpour. She slipped while trying to retreat through the back path, cutting her palm on a sharp rock. Shadow, who had not moved quickly since his rescue, rose to his feet. From the shadows of his enclosure, he watched the girl stumble and press her bleeding hand to her chest. The wind howled. She looked terrified, not of the injury, but of the storm itself. The crack of distant thunder echoed like the sound of trees splitting in fire. Shadow pressed his nose to the wire gate and let out a low, guttural whine. When Evelyn turned, their eyes met for the first time, fully, directly. It wasn't just recognition. It was shared memory. Grace arrived moments later, soaked and panicked. She scooped Evelyn up and rushed her into the center, unaware of what had passed between the child and the dog. But when she returned later with dry towels and bandages, she found Shadow lying near the gate, eyes still fixed on where Evelyn had stood. From that moment on, Shadow began to shift. Slowly. Carefully. He started to eat when Grace was nearby. He began to lift his head when Brenda spoke. He no longer cowered at approaching footsteps. The figurine remained beside him, untouched by rain, as if it had become a symbol of something neither child nor dog could explain. They called him Ghost Dog. But ghosts don't respond to kindness. And Shadow had just taken his first step back into the world of the living. The wind had shifted that morning, bringing with it the crisp bite of approaching autumn. The scent of smoke had long since faded from the town of Caldera Ridge, but the memory of it still lingered in those who had lived through the fire, etched into their bones like soot on brick. At Clear Creek Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the rhythm of daily care continued, feeding schedules, wound treatments, cautious whispers around kennels where healing was still a fragile thread. But inside the farthest enclosure, something subtle had changed. Shadow, once known only as the Ghost Dog, had begun to lift his head at familiar footsteps. He didn't approach the gate, but he no longer recoiled. His food bowls were empty each morning. And most importantly, his eyes were no longer blank. It was on a quiet Tuesday that a new figure stepped into the center, a man whose boots were scuffed, whose walk had a slight limp, and whose presence seemed to carry both weight and silence. Tom Walker, in his late 40s, wore a faded navy jacket with an old fire department patch barely holding onto the fabric. His frame was lean, sinewy from years of fieldwork, and his weathered face bore the faint creases of someone who had spent more time watching flames than sleeping. His beard was salt and pepper, trimmed but not meticulous, and his eyes were steel blue, sharp, watchful, but distant, like a man who had lost more than he said. Tom had recently relocated to Caldera Ridge after retiring from active service with the Cascade Regional Fire Unit. Known among his peers as dependable and unshakable in emergencies, he had a reputation for staying behind longer than protocols allowed, searching for strays, for children, for anything breathing beneath rubble. But after a particularly devastating fire in Bidwell Canyon 2 months ago, he had taken an indefinite leave. Something in him had fractured when they couldn't save everyone. When he entered Clear Creek, it wasn't as a firefighter, it was as a man still carrying something unsaid. Grace Patel greeted him at the reception with her usual notepad and shy smile. "Hi, are you here to volunteer or?" "Volunteer," Tom replied, his voice gravelly but kind. "I heard you've been overrun with rescues from the August fires. Figured I'd lend a hand." Brenda appeared from the back office, her glasses perched low on her nose. "You with the fire crew that handled Bidwell?" Tom nodded. "Well," she said, scanning him with a practiced eye, "we've got enough cleaning to drown in. But we could use someone who knows how to keep calm around trauma cases." He followed her through the center, nodding politely at other volunteers. As they approached the rear enclosures, Brenda slowed. "There's one case in particular," she said. "A German Shepherd. Burn survivor. No owner. No microchip. Won't let anyone near him, but he started to show a bit of life again." She opened the gate gently. "Name's Shadow." As soon as Tom stepped inside the gravel path beside the enclosure, Shadow, who had been lying near the back wall, suddenly lifted his head. Not a full rise, not a bark, but a sharp tilt of the ears, focused, alert. Tom froze. Something about the dog, a way he held his body, the pattern of burns along the back flank, even the shape of the eyes, felt hauntingly familiar. "Where'd you find him?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the shepherd. "Truck wreck, just past mile marker 12, on Ridgewood Trail," Brenda replied, arms folded. "He was under the chassis, half buried in ash." If they'd been 10 minutes later. Tom's throat went dry. We had to pull back from that area during the third night of the blaze. The wind shifted hard. I remember, there was a dog, trapped. I tried to get him, but a tree came down between us. His voice lowered. I didn't think he made it. Shadow stood up slowly, his legs stiff but deliberate. He walked halfway to the gate and sat down. His eyes locked on Tom. No fear. No retreat. Just, watching. Well, Brenda said, her voice softer now, seems like he remembers you better than you remember him. That afternoon, Tom returned with an old canvas bag from his fire days. He sat outside Shadow's kennel and pulled out a scorched glove, one he hadn't worn since the Bidwell fire. He set it gently on the ground between them. Shadow sniffed the air, ears twitching. After a moment, he stepped forward. One paw. Then two. He didn't touch the glove, but he didn't look away. In the shadow of the trees, something unseen passed between them. Later that day, Evelyn arrived through her usual hidden path. She paused when she saw Tom sitting outside Shadow's enclosure, both man and dog quiet in mutual stillness. The girl, usually shy around strangers, took a hesitant step forward. Her hand was still wrapped in a light bandage from the storm fall, but her eyes were curious, wide. Tom turned, offering a small nod. Didn't mean to scare you, kid. You didn't, Evelyn replied, almost in a whisper. She sat on the concrete step beside him, still a few feet away but close enough for her voice to carry. He likes you, she said. Maybe he remembers me, Tom murmured. Or maybe he just knows I needed to see him again. Evelyn stared at the dog, then back at the glove. You're the one who tried to save him. Tom gave a soft chuckle, his voice tinged with something older than guilt. I didn't do enough. You're here now, she said simply. They sat in silence for a while. Tom glanced sideways at the girl, noticing the wariness in her posture, the way her shoulders stayed tight, even in calm. You like dogs? I didn't, she said. But he's different. They exchanged no further words that day, but from then on, Evelyn began to refer to him, quietly, and only to herself, as Fireman Tom. She would bring extra apple slices on the days she knew he'd be there, though she never offered them directly. And when she spoke to Shadow, she often whispered stories as if both the dog and the man beside him were the same, haunted, burnt, but not gone. Each day, Shadow grew bolder. He began to approach the gate when he saw Tom. When Evelyn hummed or drew, he lay near the front of the kennel instead of in shadowed corners. Grace noticed the change first. Whatever you're doing, she told Tom one evening, keep doing it. I'm not doing anything, Tom replied. Just sitting. Brenda smirked. Sometimes that's all a soul needs. By the week's end, Shadow had allowed Tom to touch his head for the first time. A tentative gesture, brief but powerful. And when Evelyn dropped her sketchbook one afternoon, it was Shadow, of his own will, who approached the gate, tail twitching, to watch her pick it up. The walls they had built around themselves, man, dog, and child, were slowly, gently beginning to crack. And from those cracks, something warmer began to seep through. The morning began with a stillness that felt almost sacred. The wind had died, and the skies over Caldera Ridge were washed in a soft amber hue, as if the sun itself had slowed to watch something unfold. The birds chirped half-heartedly, their songs muted by the lingering memory of smoke that had once filled the valley. At Clear Creek, the hum of the day was already underway, volunteers cleaning enclosures, the vet team rotating through treatments, and somewhere near the back, a man and a dog who had found each other through the quiet. Tom Walker arrived earlier than usual. He carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his firefighter jacket folded inside. The jacket was heavy, not just in weight but in memory, smelling faintly of smoke, soil, and the resin of pine trees scorched under a furious blaze. He hadn't worn it since the night they evacuated Bidwell Canyon, but something had told him to bring it today. Not as a symbol. Not as a tool. Just as a whisper from the past that might mean something to the dog who had once watched him walk away. Shadow was already awake. He stood at the front of the enclosure when Tom approached, his tail held low but no longer tucked. His eyes tracked every movement Tom made. There was a question in them now, not fear, not despair, but cautious curiosity. "Morning, partner," Tom said quietly, kneeling down in front of the gate. He reached into the duffel and pulled out the jacket. Gently, he laid it on the ground just outside the gate. The fabric fell with a soft thump, puffing up a faint cloud of ash. Shadow took a single step forward. Then another. His nose twitched. Tom said nothing. The shepherd lowered his head, sniffing the fabric with slow, deliberate breaths. His body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. He moved closer to the gate until his nose pressed against the mesh. Tom reached forward slowly, palm up, his other hand resting on his knee. Shadow's eyes flicked from the jacket to the hand. And then, without hesitation, he leaned in and gently licked Tom's fingers. It was the first physical contact they'd shared. Not forced. Not coaxed. A choice. Tom didn't move, didn't speak. He let the moment stand for what it was. From a few yards away, Grace Patel, who had just stepped out with a tray of morning meds, froze mid-step. She blinked once, twice, and then whispered, "Holy hell." Brenda joined her moments later. "Told you," Grace said. "That man's more medicine than any of us." Meanwhile, Evelyn Harper watched from her usual spot behind the greenhouse. She had started arriving a little later in the mornings, on purpose. Her grandmother, May, had begun noticing the dirt on her shoes and the thinning pages of her sketchbook, but she never asked questions. Not since Evelyn had started smiling again. Today, Evelyn carried a tiny backpack. Inside was a single item, a disposable lighter. It had taken her 4 days to even hold it without flinching. She had found it behind the kitchen cabinet, forgotten and half-used. Its click and spark terrified her, reminded her of the first snap of the fire that had swallowed their home. But Tom had once told her that facing fire didn't mean loving it. It meant not letting it tell your story. So, that afternoon, while her grandmother napped in the living room, Evelyn boiled water on the old camping stove outside their cottage. Her fingers trembled as she flicked the lighter. The flame came to life, blue and steady. She didn't cry. She didn't drop it. Instead, she whispered, "Just a little fire. Just enough to make something warm." The water bubbled slowly. She stirred in the noodles, her eyes never leaving the pot. When they were done, she carried the bowl inside with both hands and set it down in front of her grandmother. "Lunch," she said, and smiled. May looked up, startled, then pulled the girl into a gentle hug. Back at Clear Creek, Tom had moved inside Shadow's enclosure for the first time under Brenda's supervision. The dog hadn't bolted. He hadn't growled. He had simply watched. As Tom sat cross-legged in the corner, Shadow paced once, then settled near the opposite wall. Not close. But not far. Tom placed the jacket beside him, folded neatly. He spoke softly, more to himself than to the dog. "I remember the sound of trees cracking like bones. The smell of cedar turned to smoke. We lost a doe that night, trapped under the ridge. I tried to reach her, but the wind took the whole slope." Shadow's ears flicked. Tom looked at him. "I thought I lost you too." The shepherd blinked slowly. Grace, who was watching through the monitoring camera, wrote in her log, "Subject exhibits strong associative behavior with former rescuer. Trust appears to be developing through scent and memory. Recommend continued supervised exposure." That night, Evelyn added a new drawing to her sketchbook. It was Shadow, standing at the front of his enclosure, tail raised slightly, eyes focused on something just out of frame. In the corner of the page, she drew a small flame with a noodle pot beside it. When she showed it to Tom the next day, he laughed. "You're braver than I ever was," he said. "No," Evelyn replied, "just tired of being scared." Shadow lay beside them as they spoke, his head resting on the jacket. He watched them, not with suspicion, but with something slower, gentler, something like belonging. And somewhere in the ashes of memory, the call that once went unanswered had finally been heard. The days grew shorter as September gently leaned into October. Mornings came wrapped in a cool mist, and the trees lining the Clear Creek property began to blush with the first hints of autumn. It was the season of soft earth and golden light, of things fading but not yet gone. Inside the center, recovery moved slowly, burned wings began to stretch again, singed fur grew back in tufts, and one German shepherd, once a ghost in the corner of his kennel, had started to live again. Shadow now ate with calm precision, but only when Tom was present. It wasn't hunger that drove him, but safety, the sense that nothing could harm him so long as that man sat nearby. Tom, in turn, adjusted his routine. He arrived earlier, stayed longer. He brought books with cracked spines and worn covers, reading them aloud in a low, soothing voice. It didn't matter if it was a field guide or a novel, Shadow lay beside him, ears occasionally twitching, eyes half-lidded in a state of listening. One particular afternoon, the rain had come early. Soft and steady, it tapped against the tin roof above Shadow's enclosure as Tom pulled up a chair just outside the gate. He carried an old notebook this time, smaller, leather-bound, its corners frayed. As Shadow settled on his blanket, Tom opened the book and began to speak, not as a reader, but as a man remembering. "There was a raccoon once," he said, his voice quiet over the rhythm of rain. "She had 3 kits, little things, barely bigger than my hand. We found them trapped in a drainage pipe after a storm. Everyone said it wasn't worth the risk. But I crawled in anyway. Spent 2 hours on my stomach, covered in mud. She didn't hiss. Just looked at me like she already knew I'd come." Shadow blinked slowly. 2 survived. 1 didn't. And I carried the little one out in my shirt, thinking, I don't know, maybe saving one made it okay to lose the others." He fell silent for a long moment. Shadow rose, walked to the gate, and lay down beside it, his body pressed gently against the metal bars. Tom smiled faintly and kept talking. He spoke of animals he'd held as they passed, of fires that had taken too much too fast, of people who thanked him and people who never came back. There was no bitterness in his voice, just the slow ache of someone who'd carried too many endings without pause. Shadow didn't flinch. He listened, not as a dog, but as something more, a presence anchoring Tom in the now, giving his stories a place to rest. Meanwhile, Evelyn had been busy with something of her own. After the success of her noodle experiment, she felt braver. Less like the girl who ran from fire, and more like someone who had learned to hold a little of it in her hands. She started sketching again. Not in secret this time, but out in the open, sitting cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom with colored pencils scattered around her like fallen leaves. The centerpiece was a large sheet of poster paper she'd taken from May's sewing room, white, clean, untouched. She drew a forest. Not the forest she had seen on fire, but the one she remembered before it. Green and golden, with sunlight slicing through tall firs. Birds perched on branches. A river wound through mossy stones. And near the center, just beneath a tree with bright yellow leaves, she drew a dog. Not just any dog. Shadow, strong and tall, his fur full and healthy, his eyes alert but calm. When she finished, she rolled it up carefully and tied it with a string. The next morning, she walked to Clear Creek through the official entrance, not sneaking this time, but hand in hand with her grandmother May, who had finally agreed to bring her in properly. May Harper, sharp-eyed and proud, stood with arms folded as Evelyn approached Brenda at the front desk. "She has something for the dog," May said, her tone brisk but not unkind. Brenda raised an eyebrow. "Shadow?" Evelyn nodded. Grace, who overheard from the hallway, smiled. "He'll like it." They let Evelyn through, supervised but trusted. Tom was already there, sitting beside Shadow's enclosure with the jacket folded in his lap. The shepherd looked up at the sound of Evelyn's shoes, then sat straighter when he saw what she carried. Evelyn gave Tom a small smile. "Can I hang this in his space?" Tom stood and opened the gate, allowing her in. Brenda hovered nearby but said nothing. Evelyn unrolled the poster and held it up. The colors were vibrant, the lines soft and flowing like dream fragments caught on paper. Shadow walked forward slowly, nostrils flaring at the smell of pencil shavings and paper. He paused in front of the drawing, then sat down, head tilted. Evelyn hung the picture in the corner, tacking it to the wooden wall where it wouldn't be touched by rain or wind. Shadow didn't move. He simply stared, eyes locked on the image of the forest, of the version of himself Evelyn had drawn. Whole. Free. Home. "Do you think he remembers?" Evelyn asked. Tom looked at her. "Maybe. Or maybe you just gave him something to dream about." They left the drawing there. And from that day forward, whenever Shadow lay in his kennel, he did so facing the picture, as if holding vigil over a place he hoped to return to, or perhaps had never truly left. At night, Evelyn drew more. Not just forests, but people, her grandmother sipping tea, Tom holding a shovel in front of a fire truck, even Grace feeding a baby fox. Each picture told a small story of healing. Of pieces returning to where they once belonged. Tom started keeping a log of Shadow's progress. Shows increased interest in human presence. Responds to sound and scent stimuli. Displays signs of memory association. But beneath the clinical notes, he wrote something else in the margins: "He listens when I speak. Not with obedience. With empathy." The bond between them had moved beyond recognition. It had become trust. And between the man who couldn't save everyone and the dog who hadn't been saved in time, there was now a shared truth. They had saved each other. The storm rolled in without warning, one of those sudden, late autumn tantrums that arrived with a flash and stayed long enough to rattle windows and soak the roots. The sky over Caldera Ridge turned iron gray by mid-afternoon, and by the time the first lightning bolt slashed across the sky, the air had already thickened with tension. The staff at Clear Creek moved quickly, securing tarps, double-checking kennel locks, and herding the smaller animals into their protected shelters. Rain began to fall in dense, cold sheets. Inside the center, Brenda paced like a general before battle. Her raincoat was 2 sizes too big, hanging off her frame like a cape, and her graying hair had curled frantically in the humidity. She shouted orders over the wind. "Shut the south wing. Move the fox kits inside. We've got 2 hours before the creek floods." Tom was already on site, having arrived earlier that day for his usual time with Shadow. When the weather turned, he stayed, because something in his bones told him this storm was more than just water and wind. In the corner kennel, Shadow stood alert, his gaze fixed on the trees swaying beyond the chain-link fence. The old firefighter jacket Tom had left inside lay untouched now, its purpose served. Shadow had begun forming a new habit, standing near the gate whenever Tom or Evelyn were nearby, watching not just them, but the rhythm of the center, the staff, the routines. He was no longer drifting. He was learning the beat again. At 5:11 p.m., the power went out. Not a flicker. A complete, sudden darkness that snuffed out hallway lights and security monitors in a single breath. The backup generators rumbled for a second, then died. Brenda swore under her breath. Damn transformer must have taken a hit. Grace scrambled for flashlights. Tom pulled out his phone, its dim glow barely enough to light the corridor. But in the chaos, no one noticed that Evelyn, who had come that evening with a new sketchbook in hand, had gone missing. May had dropped her off near the front lobby before heading to the pharmacy. Evelyn had promised to stay inside, to sit quietly near the main reading room until the storm passed. But curiosity, and the thunderous roar of the rain, had drawn her elsewhere. She had wandered into the older storage shed behind the supply wing, chasing the sound of a baby owl that had been temporarily moved there after a wing injury. She loved owls, how still they were, how silent and unbothered by darkness. She thought she could sit with it, maybe draw it. But the heavy door slammed shut behind her with the weight of the wind, and the latch clicked from the outside. Inside, it was pitch black. No flashlight. No windows. Just the sound of her breathing and the echo of distant thunder. She screamed once, sharp, panicked, and then went silent, too scared to scream again. Shadow heard her. It wasn't just the sound that reached him, it was something deeper, something built into his bones from the days he had trained beside men like Tom. It was instinct, calling him out of stillness. He let out a low growl and pushed against the gate. Tom, across the courtyard, froze. Did you hear that? Brenda shined her flashlight toward the kennels. Sounded like. The crash of metal interrupted her. Shadow had thrown his full weight against the gate, not once, but twice, until the latch, old and rusted, gave way with a groan. By the time Brenda and Tom reached the enclosure, Shadow was gone, darting across the yard like a shadow made real. He's out. Grace shouted. No, Tom said, eyes narrowing. He's going somewhere. And he followed. Shadow cut through the rain-soaked center with precision. He didn't bark. He didn't panic. He moved like he had always known the layout of this place. When he reached the back lot, he stopped in front of the old storage shed and let out a single, loud bark, a sound that cut through the storm like a beacon. Tom arrived seconds later. Evelyn, he called, pressing against the shed's door. Evelyn, are you in there? A muffled sob answered him. Tom yanked the latch, now swollen from rain and rust. It stuck. Shadow paced behind him, ears flat, whimpering low and urgent. Tom gritted his teeth and kicked the door once, then again. On the third try, it gave way with a wrenching creak. Evelyn stood in the darkness, soaked, shaking, but unharmed. She flew into Tom's arms. Then, just as quickly, she turned and threw her arms around Shadow, who pressed his head gently against her chest. You found me, she whispered. You really found me. Later that evening, after the storm had passed and the generator finally sputtered back to life, the center was filled with a quiet buzz. Staff whispered about the dog who had broken out to save a child. Volunteers exchanged looks that said more than words ever could. Brenda stood beside the broken gate, arms crossed. Well, she said, voice low but smiling, looks like Ghost Dog just reminded us who he really is. Tom leaned against the doorframe beside her. He's not a ghost anymore. Inside the main building, Evelyn sat on a wool blanket, wrapped in a towel. May fussed gently over her, rubbing her hands dry. Grace brought her a cup of warm milk, and Brenda knelt beside her with a flashlight. Do you know how scared we were? Brenda said, mock stern. Evelyn gave a sleepy smile. But I wasn't scared. Not really. Why not? May asked. She looked across the room at Shadow, who now lay near the hallway door, eyes half closed, breathing steady. Because my hero came, she said. And he's not afraid of the dark. From that night forward, Evelyn began sleeping with the lights off. And when asked what helped her most, she would always say, he didn't just rescue me from the shed. He rescued me from the part of me that still thought the dark could hurt me. The mornings had begun to taste like frost. At Clear Creek, leaves rattled across the gravel paths like paper ghosts, and breath came in visible clouds even as the sun rose higher in the sky. October's end was near. The animals were quieter, their energy turned inward as if bracing for winter. And somewhere inside the center, a decision had been made that felt like the closing of a chapter no one wanted to end. Tom Walker sat with his back against the wall of Shadow's enclosure, the German shepherd lying peacefully beside him. There was no leash between them now, no need for caution. Shadow came and went freely inside his fenced space, and often, when the gate was open, he chose to stay near Tom's boots instead of wandering. But it wasn't contentment that anchored him anymore, it was readiness. Something in the dog's posture had changed. He wasn't healing now. He was waiting. "He's different," Dr. Samantha Rose said quietly one morning, sipping her coffee beside Brenda. "Not just calm. He's searching. Like he's outgrown this place." Brenda, who rarely indulged in sentiment, nodded once. "He's pacing the fences again. That's a dog who remembers what it feels like to run." Tom heard the same thing in every meeting. Shadow was healthy. His burns had healed. His behavior had stabilized beyond their expectations. The question was no longer if he could reintegrate, it was when and where. And for Tom, the answer came easily. "There's a preserve," he told them, "about 10 miles from my old station. Pine Creek Reserve. It's federally monitored but open for supervised release. Water sources, light foot traffic, and plenty of terrain. I know the area. I could help with observation." Dr. Rowe raised an eyebrow. "You'd move back?" Tom shrugged. "Maybe not permanently. But I owe him that much." Word spread quickly through the center, and with it, a quiet undercurrent of grief. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. Shadow wasn't just another rescue. He was a symbol of something they'd all carried. To see him go would be like releasing the part of themselves that believed healing was possible. When Evelyn found out, she didn't cry. She stood very still, then nodded once and whispered, "I knew he wasn't mine forever." May, standing beside her, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That doesn't mean he won't remember you." Evelyn spent the next 3 evenings working on something special. In her bedroom, surrounded by her drawings and worn sketchbooks, she pulled out a strip of soft red fabric from her grandmother's old sewing chest. It had once been the lining of a holiday dress she'd worn when she was 6. Carefully, clumsily, but with great focus, she stitched 5 letters onto one corner, EVYSLIGHT. The stitching was uneven. The thread looped too tightly in some places, too loose in others. But it was hers. On the morning of the departure, the sky was silver with low-hanging clouds, the kind that promised a quiet drizzle before noon. The staff gathered near the center's loading gate. Tom stood beside a large transport crate, not enclosed but open and lined with blankets. Shadow sat calmly beside it, his ears flicking but his body relaxed. Brenda brought out a clipboard, her voice slightly rougher than usual. "All documents signed. Microchip data logged with the preserve. He's officially a free citizen again." Dr. Rowe knelt and gave Shadow a slow stroke across the back. "You're a miracle," she murmured. "And you gave us all one." Evelyn stepped forward last. She wore a wool sweater too big for her and muddy boots that had seen too many puddles. In her hand was the red scarf. "Hi, buddy," she said, crouching beside him. Shadow licked her hand, gently and without urgency. "I made you something. It's not much, but it's a little piece of me to keep with you." She tied the scarf around his neck, not tightly, just enough for it to sit snug against his fur. Shadow didn't flinch. He stood tall, tail neutral, eyes watching her as if memorizing the shape of her face. Tom helped him into the crate, but didn't shut the door. "Whenever you're ready," he said softly. Shadow looked once more at the faces gathered, the ones who had whispered hope into him when he was only fear, and then stepped inside. The drive to Pine Creek Reserve was quiet. Evelyn rode up front with Tom while Brenda followed behind in a second truck. The road curved gently through tall pines and yellowing oaks, the forest floor carpeted with needles and last season's leaves. By the time they reached the trailhead, the clouds had begun to part, casting dappled light through the trees. A reserve officer named Carla Monroe met them at the gate. She was in her mid-30s, lean and wiry, with a no-nonsense energy softened by warm eyes and a wide-brimmed ranger hat that seemed too large for her head. She spoke with authority but smiled like someone who truly believed in second chances. "We've got a quiet cove by the southern ridge," she told Tom. "Water, shade, low elevation. And we've already set up monitoring stations." Tom nodded. "He won't go far at first." Carla looked into the crate, then back at him. "And you? You going to be okay letting him go?" Tom didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back and opened the crate door. Shadow stepped out slowly, paws crunching on gravel. He sniffed the air, then looked back at Tom. "You don't have to stay near," Tom said. "But I'll be around if you need me." Shadow took a few steps toward the trees. The wind lifted the red scarf around his neck like a flag. He paused, turned his head one last time, eyes lingering on Evelyn, then vanished into the underbrush with the ease of something returning to where it belonged. Evelyn stood still, her face calm but flushed. "I didn't say goodbye," she said. Tom shook his head. "That's good. Goodbye ends things. This was just a beginning." As they walked back to the truck, Evelyn looked over her shoulder, hoping for one last glimpse, but the forest was still. Still, and full of life. It was a soft morning in late November when Tom and Evelyn returned to Pine Creek Reserve. The air smelled of wet earth and fallen pine needles, and the sun emerged in long, low beams that cut across the forest floor like golden threads. A light fog clung to the lower slopes, weaving through tree trunks and swirling above the paths like a spirit reluctant to leave. Though colder now, the reserve breathed with a kind of quiet power, unbothered by the seasons, unchanged by memory. But for the two visitors walking the familiar trail, everything had changed. Tom Walker wore his ranger's jacket over a flannel shirt, his boots worn but steady. The weeks since Shadow's release had not softened him, they had focused him. His days were now spent charting animal movement, monitoring the new wildlife camera feeds, and helping Carla Monroe with the quieter but still vital rhythms of preserve life. He had moved into a small ranger's cabin not far from the southern ridge, and for the first time in years, he slept through the night. Beside him walked Evelyn Harper, bundled in a navy blue coat, a wool beanie pulled down over her ears. Her hair peeked out in wild curls, and in her gloved hand she carried a folded piece of red fabric, weathered at the edges, but still bright. Evie's light, still stitched in thread that had begun to fray. She didn't hold it like something fragile. She held it like something that had traveled with her through fire and come out the other side. "Do you think he'll come?" she asked, her voice nearly lost under the weight of damp leaves beneath their boots. Tom didn't answer right away. He just nodded toward a narrow break in the trees ahead, a clearing where the underbrush had thinned and the sunlight pooled like a warm lake. They stepped into it, side by side. It was quiet for a few moments. Just birdsong, the wind in the upper branches, and the creak of bark. Then a shape appeared at the edge of the clearing. At first, it was no more than a silhouette, low and sleek, moving with the graceful certainty of something that belonged to the wild. But as it drew closer, there was no mistaking it. The gait, powerful yet measured. The fur, now full and glossy with only the faintest shadow of old scars. The red scarf still around his neck, dulled by rain and sun but unmistakable. Shadow. He paused a few yards away, ears perked, head tilted. Evelyn stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from joy that was too big to hold still. She held up the red scarf she had brought as if offering it back to the one who had made it matter. Shadow moved then, no hesitation, no wariness. He trotted toward her with a low woof of recognition, tail swaying like a slow metronome. When he reached her, he didn't bark. He didn't leap. He sat. Then leaned forward, nose touching the scarf, and let out a quiet breath that seemed to say, "I remember." Evelyn dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around him. He allowed it fully, burying his nose in her shoulder. The girl who once couldn't hold a lighter now held a creature shaped by fire. And in that embrace, she was not afraid. Tom watched them with a lump in his throat. In all his years of service, he had seen courage, loyalty, sacrifice, but this was something else. This was what survival looked like when it was softened by trust. He came, Evelyn said into Shadow's fur. Tom knelt beside them. He always knew you'd come back. Carla Monroe appeared from the path minutes later, waving as she approached. We saw him on the camera heading toward this clearing. I figured he knew the schedule better than we do now. She crouched down and scratched behind Shadow's ear. He's been checking in every few days. Doesn't stay long. But always leaves a paw print near the trail camera. Almost like he wants to say, still here. Still whole. Tom smiled. That's him. Always halfway wild, halfway watching. The three of them sat in the clearing a while longer, the late morning sun warming the forest around them. Shadow eventually lay down beside Evelyn, head resting on her lap, eyes closed in a state of complete ease. Evelyn reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper. A letter, written in crayon, with uneven lines and a crooked drawing of a girl and a dog beneath a tree. She placed it under a stone near the base of an oak. What's that? Carla asked. A thank you, Evelyn said. For whatever part of the forest kept him safe when we couldn't. They stayed until the sun began to move behind the ridge. Then Evelyn stood, kissed Shadow on the head, and whispered, "You're not Ghost Dog anymore. You're Shadow the Survivor." He looked up, eyes deep with something older than instinct. Then, with a slow wag of his tail, he stood, turned, and vanished into the woods, no longer a secret, no longer afraid. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn's story and Shadow's journey began to circulate throughout Caldera Ridge and beyond. A local journalist, intrigued by the center's miracle dog, published a piece titled "The Shepherd Who Found His Way Back." It was picked up by a regional outlet, and soon letters arrived from families who had lost pets in wildfires, from children who'd been afraid of dogs and now weren't, and from firefighters who remembered what it felt like to pull something alive from smoke and believe it meant something. Tom was offered a permanent role as a wildlife behavior consultant for the preserve. He accepted. Evelyn returned to school with new drawings, trees that bent but didn't break, animals who carried fire in their fur but smiled anyway. Her classmates stopped calling her the quiet girl and started calling her the storyteller. And Shadow, though never fully domesticated again, became something of a legend. A wild dog with a red scarf and a habit of appearing at the edge of campfires, watching for a while, then vanishing again. The ranger station kept a file of his sightings. Someone carved a wooden sign near the southern ridge that simply read, "Here walks Shadow. He came from fire. He stayed for love." Shadow's journey reminds us that God's miracles often come softly, in the form of second chances, quiet acts of courage, and the kind of love that refuses to give up. He wasn't just a dog who survived the fire, he was a reminder that even what's been through the worst can rise again, stronger and freer. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs hope. And if you believe that God still works through quiet miracles, type Amen in the comments. May He bless you and everyone walking their own road through the ashes.